Hello and welcome to Taiwan Talks. I'm Inka Vat. Joining us today is Elbridge Colby, the principal and co-founder of the Marathon Initiative, a think tank focused on developing strategies to equip the US for great power competition. He was also the US Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense from 2017 to 2018 in the Trump administration, where he took the lead in crafting Trump's 2018 National Defense Strategy, which focused on China as America's greatest threat. Elbridge's most recent book is The Strategy of Denial: American Defense in an Age of Great Power Conflict. Elbridge believes the Chinese Communist Party represents a serious threat not just to Taiwan, but also to US economic security, prosperity and freedom. A very warm welcome to the show, Elbridge, today.
Thank you so much.
Let's start with Donald Trump. So the former president has said that he could end Russia's war in Ukraine in a day. What do you think he would do with Taiwan?
Well, wonderful to be on your show, and let me stress that I don't speak for President Trump or for his campaign or anything. But I think what President Trump has indicated, if you look at his record and his statements, is I think he has a pretty tough view of China and his administration on the defense side, but also on the economic side with things like tariffs led by Ambassador Lighthizer and others. Took a much more, I would say, realistic and confrontational approach towards China. At the same time, on the campaign trail, he's also been tough on China, and the political constituency supporting him sees China as the top threat to the United States. Now, at the same time, President Trump has suggested that he's open to negotiations and discussion with Beijing and with Xi Jinping, which I think is actually the right approach. Speak softly and carry a big stick, or be prepared to talk from a position of strength. So, what exactly he would plan to do, I don't know. He's made clear, and Ambassador Lighthizer has also suggested, I believe on his behalf, that there would be more measures towards economic decoupling. I think it's going to be very important, if our country pursues that we do so from a position of military strength here along the First Island chain.
And so, comparing Trump's views on Taiwan with yours, where do you think that they might differ?
Well, I don't think there necessarily is a difference. I mean, my view is that my arguments in my book and the role I played in the 2018 National Defense Strategy, that is predicated on what you could call an America First approach. I mean, my arguments are based on the idea that our foreign policy should be in Americans' interest, albeit in an enlightened self-interest kind of way, but that the best interests of Americans is served by preventing China from dominating Asia, and instead having a balance of power, and that the Taiwan's security and continued autonomy, based on the status quo roughly, is if not necessary, very, very helpful to sustaining that balance of power. So I would say that the approach that I've laid out is the one that I believe is most consistent with that America First approach.
And let's go into that a little bit more, because I believe that there's sort of three aspects to that: economic security, prosperity, and freedom, which you say is, in a sense, under threat from China. Tell me more about how American freedom is threatened.
Sure. Well, I think unfortunately it involves a couple of steps. And here in Taiwan, people feel the threat from the PRC very immediately. Xi Jinping and Beijing has made very clear that it essentially is resolute in seeking to subordinate this free society. So, if anything, I'm surprised by the lack of fear and urgency here in Taiwan. So I would only encourage Taiwanese, for their own sake, but also to impress upon Americans their own commitment to have more of a sense of urgency. With Americans, it's a little bit more of an indirect argument, but I nonetheless believe it's very real, and it's actually rooted in actually classic American strategic thought, which is to say, look, if China, I believe it's pretty clear at this point that China has ambitions well beyond Taiwan. I mean, you can see it by the political statements and so forth, but perhaps most revealingly by the military forces and bases they're developing that go way beyond Taiwan, the South China Sea, Cambodia. They're looking for bases in Equatorial Guinea, Oman, et cetera. They're building aircraft carriers, space architecture. Their ambitions go way beyond Taiwan. I think at a minimum, what they're pursuing, and they have their reasons for doing so, is what I think of as a secure geoeconomic sphere. Basically a secure sphere that they dominate economically, and from which they would be the dominant power in the world, able to cow other regions and essentially rearray the world economic system for the benefit of the people on mainland China. If that were to happen, Americans' economic prosperity would, I think, unquestionably suffer, and because we would be under the thumb economically of China, I think our freedoms would also suffer. In a sense, we can already see that in a mild way, where China punishes people who say things about Hong Kong or Xinjiang or Taiwan. That would amplify by orders of magnitude if China were dominant over Asia.
Many people say that, moving to Ukraine, that China sees Ukraine as a test of Western resolve. Do you believe that they do see that way?
I don't think that's primarily how they see it. And I've made public that and I've been very publicly disagreed with the government here in Taiwan, which I think is doing a lot of great things on security. We could do a lot more. But the government here in Taiwan has very closely associated itself with the Ukraine cause, and I think that doesn't make sense. Why? I think that's fundamentally a way of looking at the world. You could see that resolve perspective as being what you could call the liberal internationalist way. Even the words you're using, test, teach Russia a lesson, these kinds of things, as if China is sort of a student in a classroom that needs to be instructed. Whereas I think the right way to look at the world for our own security, and I think manifestly the way that Beijing is looking at it, is through more of a realpolitik lens. Now, I think we should use realpolitik for freedom and democracy and sovereignty. They have different ambitions. But here's the test case to decide if China has determined that Russia is where, and Ukraine is where Taiwan's fate will be resolved. No other country other than Taiwan itself cares more about Taiwan than Beijing by a long shot, including the United States. If they actually thought that Taiwan's fate was going to be settled in Ukraine, would they stay below the level of Western sanctions? Would they avoid giving direct military aid? No, they would intervene in the war directly. When the United States intervened in Korea and the Chinese thought that their security was threatened, they intervened. I have no doubt that the Chinese would intervene if they thought they could successfully solve the Taiwan. No, instead what's happening is something different, which is what I would expect, which is that the Chinese are depleting and distracting the United States in another theater. And the problem is that the United States is not what it was in 1999, economically, militarily. 30 to 40% of our attack submarines, which are absolutely essential for a defense of Taiwan, are in maintenance at any given time. We spend almost $1 trillion, and we can't produce artillery ammunition as well as the Russians can. So we can't do everything, and we have to make choices. My argument is we should make choices for Taiwan's defense, not because I'm out of favor to you, but because I think that's the most in our own interest. And so it's very difficult when I present that argument to help Taiwan by saying we should give Taiwan weapons first. We should give Taiwan attention to the defense industrial base first. We should give Taiwan money first. And then I have the Taiwanese government saying, oh, no, you should support Ukraine. The number one argument I get when I'm trying to help Taiwan defend itself from a Chinese invasion that Xi Jinping is not even denying they're planning is to hear from the government in Taipei that they have a different view. Well, and it also suggests something about the resolve of the people on Taiwan. And I want to stress that the American people are very tired of war. We've made a lot of mistakes, so I'm not saying that we're right about everything. But Americans, including Republicans, are not in an interventionist mood, and fighting a war with China is a big deal. So Taiwanese need to show Americans that they're serious in order to enlist American help. The expression, God helps those who help themselves. America will help those who help themselves.
So you've met with President-elect Lai Ching-te?
No, I haven't.
Not yet? Will you be meeting with him this trip?
I believe so, yeah.
Okay. So what will you say to him?
I'll say essentially this, and this is what I've communicated to, and I think they enough of them are on my Twitter feed that they know what I think, and I've appeared, so we have a difference of view. I don't think I'm going to change their view about the Ukraine issue. What I can stress, and I think is the most important thing to stress, is a lot of delegations, a lot of visitors come to Taiwan, and because they're polite or because they have a different view of American foreign policy, I think they may understate the precariousness of Taiwan's situation at home in the United States. And I think that the best service I can do, as somebody who regularly argues fervently for America to defend Taiwan, to help Taiwan's defense, is to stress the need for a much greater sense of urgency and commitment and focus in terms of defense spending, in terms of implementing asymmetric defense along the lines of what Admiral Lee Shi-min has laid out, in terms of increasing societal and economic resilience, all of those things.
I just want to come back to the idea of prioritizing Taiwan over Ukraine, because I wanted to talk about reputation and whether you think that reputation matters.
Yeah.
I mean, you've made the case for military strength, but
Right.
how about reputation?
Reputation does matter, but I have what you can think of as a kind of contextual, moderate form of reputation. There's some academics who argue credibility doesn't matter at all. On the other hand, the Ukraine-Taiwan linkage argument is a kind of global, universal, undifferentiated form of credibility that we all know isn't true. On your credit report in America, they don't ask whether you cheat at cards. They don't ask whether you're nice to your dog, right? They ask you about whether you pay your bills. So what's going to matter in how we're judged in standing up to China is how we stand up to China, not how we stand up to Iran, or it has maybe some moderate value, but you know what it's a lot less than? It's a lot less than being properly prepared here. Because everybody's thinking in this world where America was so much stronger than everybody else. I mean, look, we lost the war in Vietnam, unfortunately, and we ended up winning the Cold War about 15 years later, right? It couldn't, and the NATO ally, I mean, people always point to Afghanistan. We got out of Afghanistan. No ally defected to the other side, right? So I think the question you have to ask yourself if you're here in Taiwan is, given that the American defense industry and money, et cetera, political capital are scarce, is it better for us to send money and weapons halfway on the other side of the world to be used against Russians, or would it be better to have it here? Which are the Chinese going to care more about? That's just common sense.
Let's go to Xi Jinping's thinking, which you have also expressed a lot. Tell me about what you think when some people doubt that Xi Jinping would actually use force to take Taiwan.
The way I think about it is I don't have any insight into Xi Jinping's behavior. But you know what? I think basically nobody does. I mean, Xi Jinping is clearly a Leninist. He's probably paranoid. I doubt he confides in his wife. The Wall Street Journal has publicly reported that U.S. intelligence does not have good reporting. I can't say for myself, but that's been publicly reported, and I would be skeptical if anybody claimed he did. What I can say is what he says publicly is they specifically reserve the right to use military force. Wang Yi said that at Munich Security Conference, et cetera. You're, I'm sure, familiar in Chinese language. It's even more frequent. They say it even when it's not convenient for them. More importantly, they're building a military precisely to do it, and they're actively making progress year after year. And Admiral Aquilino, the commander of Indo-Pacific Command, who, by the way, has not been, I would say, sufficiently alarming in his public statements, he said the other day that China is on track to meet its 2027 goal, that the United States intelligence community has assessed Xi Jinping. I mean, Xi Jinping gave instructions to the PLA to be ready to subordinate Taiwan by 2027. The way I think about it is, it's not a guarantee it would happen, but if I told you I'm preparing to burgle your house or steal your car in 2 weeks, it would at least tell you something about my intent. So my view is the only prudent course of action is for the United States, Taiwan, and to a degree Japan and Australia to be so ready to deny a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, because I think invasion is the only prudent course for China if they want to do it, that Beijing never risks it.
I want to get to this issue of, you've been talking about this for many years, the threat, and how urgent it is. You know, you said that 6 years ago, when you were in the Pentagon, you said the lights were already flashing red. Why do you think it is that other people are not considering this as being so urgent?
That's a great question. It's something I think about a lot. One of them is the factor of time. So most people don't think in the time scales that are necessary for military changes. So in the Pentagon, for instance, the basic planning function is called the 5 years defense program. So to have an effect, you need at least 5 years. So if it's the analogy I use is the Titanic. You can't miss the iceberg if you're only, 20 yards away. You have to start turning half a mile away. And that's part of the problem, so I think is time. The other thing is people believe they have prioritized China, but it's not really changing. I candidly think in the United States, especially among the political elite, less so in the commercial world, I think they underestimate China. I don't underestimate China. People sometimes say, oh, you hate China. And I say, actually, to the contrary, I have so much respect for China that I'm afraid that it has so much power and that it could accumulate more power. And so that is, because essentially what you have now, and you also frankly have a degree of hubris among the American political elite. And that hubris is convenient to some of our allies that would rather have us deal with the tough security problems and rather not have to spend more. Like the Germans. The Germans are very happy to spend 1% on GDP and flatter the Americans. The problem is we can't do that. President Biden himself and many leading Republicans have a similar view. We're America. We can do everything. And that's just not true. The Chinese have 200 times the shipbuilding capacity the United States does. I think that's very hard. So much of it is actually a generational issue. Younger people have a better understanding. The problem is most of our leaders are not young.
Bloomberg has forecast crisis would cost $10 trillion US dollars, essentially 10%. It's like a global depression.
I don't believe that it would actually lead that, because I don't think those economic measures would actually be imposed. Economic sanctions have had essentially no real impact on Russia's decision making. They have completely failed. I mean, they were initially advertised as being able to halt Russia or change Russia's strategic decision making. Without question, they have completely failed. They have even failed to degrade Russia's own military industry. In fact, President Biden complained about this to Xi Jinping the other day, admitting that in large part because of China's help, Russian military production is at historic highs. So if Russia can evade global sanctions, we can be sure that China will evade global sanctions. And if you think that the Western countries are going to commit economic suicide to try to persuade the Chinese to get off this island once they take it, I have a bridge I would like to sell you, as we say in America. That's just not going to happen. You will see totemic sanctions.
How about the other side of the costs, human costs? You've said that World War II fostered Nazism, communism.
Yeah, no, I think the human cost would be extraordinary. I mean, especially here on Taiwan, God forbid. But I think also for U.S. forces, some of the public gaming has had, I think, the figure into the tens of thousands. And I think that's, especially if the war were to last. And I think if it were not clear, especially who had won or lost, it could very well go on into a war of attrition. The cost could be very, very high. And I think you're exactly right. I mean, one of the kind of points that we don't want a great power war, it should be obvious, is because that kind of suffering leads to radicalization. I mean, look at the radicalization that happened in China in the period after the collapse of the Qing. I mean, that is a very dangerous situation. And so again, I use the iceberg analogy. Let's not miss the sort of plan to miss the iceberg just by a few yards or meters. Let's make sure we miss the iceberg. And if we spent too much on defense, and by the way, I don't work for defense contractors. I don't have a financial interest in this. And in fact, I think we need to overhaul our defense industry in the United States. And I think there are legitimate concerns about our defense industry and our system and so forth. But I think I would be in favor of being on the prudent side of what people say, peace through strength. But peace through strength is you focus on the biggest threat.
You mentioned that you have respect for China because it is powerful, that's why it's dangerous. I understand that under your strategy of deterring or dealing with China, you say that it can still achieve its national rejuvenation. Can you tell me how this works?
Well, the way I think about it is, China, if we put into place the strategy of denial, and from the strategy of denial comes a balance of power, China will continue to grow. There will be some degree of economic de-risking and decoupling. There can be trade across that barrier. China will continue to grow, consistent with the incredible talents of the Chinese people and the scale of the Chinese economy and so forth. And so China will, I believe, at least for the foreseeable future, will be one of the top two powers of the world. Maybe India will arrive at some point, one of the top three powers of the world. It will command respect. I mean, if you had asked Sun Yat-sen that 100 years ago, I think that would have been a pretty good outcome for China. And so a normal person's interpretation of the great rejuvenation of the Chinese people, I think that is really, China has arrived. China has stood up, to use Chairman Mao's comment when he proclaimed the People's Republic. It may not satisfy Xi Jinping.
That's my next question.
Right, but Xi Jinping doesn't, I mean, it's his term, but he doesn't necessarily own the ultimate definition of what the great rejuvenation of the Chinese people is. That's why I think the main key, the major key needs to be deterrence by military denial, so that Xi Jinping, look, Mao wanted to take over Taiwan. He was getting ready to invade Taiwan in 1950. It was only the intervention of the Seventh Fleet when the war in Korea broke out. I mean, Mao was worse than Xi Jinping. He killed far more people than Xi Jinping did. But that means that deterrence by denial can apply even to the Stalins and the Maos of the world.
Yeah, because I was going to say a key plank of that obviously is to challenge U.S. power.
Right.
Although they don't write it in, that is
sure.
That is the intention.
Right.
Yeah. Let's talk about coalitions. So. Obviously, you are critical of many aspects of Biden administration's approach. You don't think they're going strong enough in investing in the right systems in terms of defense for this deterrence. But how about the coalition building? Because this week we have, of course, the trilateral with the Philippines and Japan. Last year, of course, there was a trilateral again with Japan and South Korea. So.
Right. Well, let me be clear. There's a lot that the Biden administration is doing that is very good. My main concerns are with the pace, the scope, the scale, and the urgency of the measures and the lack of focus, particularly on the military balance. So if we go back to what I said earlier, what really matters is the military balance, not a meeting of the Quad or getting together in AUKUS and having a public meeting. And what I'm afraid of is that there's more, I guess the expression is heat than light. or there's more bark than bite in a lot of these things. So for instance, to take AUKUS, which is, AUKUS is great, especially Pillar 2 of AUKUS, but Pillar 1 of AUKUS, the submarine thing, it doesn't make military sense to me. And the trilateral arrangement among South Korea, Japan, and the United States, it's positive in a lot of ways, but what has been the effect on the military balance? And what I worry is that that's where the investment has gone into, and that there's a lot of self-celebration in Washington and in some of the regional capitals to say, hey, we're getting together, and now Beijing is going to be deterred. I don't think Beijing is going to be deterred. I mean, the best analogy to this is a very similar approach to the Biden administration. In Europe, before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, they invited, I think, the Deputy Foreign Minister, Sergei Ryabkov, to NATO, and he was surrounded by 28 NATO ambassadors from pretty much all the European countries, almost. And they wagged their fingers at him, and a couple weeks later, the Russians invaded Ukraine, right? So those meetings are great insofar as they go, but the most important thing is to invest in the military balance. And I don't see that, and that's not just here. For instance, in Japan, I mean, I called on Japan 2 years ago to spend 3%. They're going to get to 2% of their 2022 budget, maybe, by 2027, which is the year that Xi Jinping has instructed the PLA to be ready. And if we go back to the 5 years window, well then, maybe a lot of that stuff is not going to get into the force until the 2030s. And we're celebrating? That doesn't make sense. Again, I don't want to be churlish, but I think there's a focus on that. The other point is I am a little concerned. Again, it's not because I sympathize with Beijing's position, but the way I think about Beijing, frankly, and forgive me if this sounds essentializing, but Beijing is like a dragon. It's a big dragon. It can, you admire it. It has it's an amazing creature. It's very dangerous. You don't poke or flap your wings in front of the dragon if you're not ready. Right, and the economic measures and the coalition building in Asia, the very public meetings, again, there's a more bark than bite problem where we might actually be convincing China that we are attempting to strangle them, but without having the military forces. And by the way, if you're China, I think you're familiar with my arguments, if you're Beijing and you want to break that coalition apart, how do you do it? The best way to do it is what I call the focused and sequential strategy, first targeting Taiwan. Why? This is an important thing for Taiwanese people to understand. It's not necessarily a bad thing for Beijing if the United States comes to Taiwan's defense if China wins. Because people say, oh, China would never risk a war. That's not true if they think they can win. I mean, how did we get California and Texas? It wasn't honestly. Look at what happened to Israel after the 6-Day War. They got the West Bank, etc. Look at the wars of German unification. So if you're Beijing, actually you could be in a situation where your best option is to try to break apart that aborning coalition by a decisive victory. And that's what really worries me. Because if you're in Manila and you're saying right now, to his credit, President Marcos is working with us. But if we get defeated in a war over Taiwan, suddenly you're going to say, wait a minute, that was not part of my calculation. And that could lead to a change, and that could lead to a shift in regional states to then align with Beijing, which would be a disaster for us.
One final question.
Sure.
Which side is more ready? The US and Taiwan or China?
I think we've entered into a period, I don't know, I don't think anybody knows for sure. I think we've entered into a period where it's unclear, where it could kind of go either way. And one of the things I'm trying to understand is, the Chinese have begun to use these roll-on, roll-off ferries. It may offer different ways of attacking Taiwan. I think the biggest thing we have going for us is obviously, people on Taiwan don't want to give up their freedom, so hopefully they're prepared and willing to fight. And I don't say that lightly. I mean, that's a big deal. And also, 100 miles or whatever it is of the Taiwan Strait. An amphibious assault is very, very difficult. But I think, my view is prepare for the worst, hope for the best. I look at the readiness and capability of the American military and what's publicly reported, and it makes me worried. And so I would say, let's not just graze that iceberg. Let's make sure we miss the iceberg. And if we spend a little bit too much money, at least we didn't test the proposition.
Elbridge Colby, thank you so much for joining us on Taiwan Talks today.
Thank you, Ian.
If you liked our show, please search for us on YouTube, give us a thumbs up, and hit subscribe to our channel. Thank you for watching the show today. Stay safe and see you next time.
There's so many things that I wish the world could see.
It is amazing to watch this captain maneuver this giant ship.
It takes 3 days to cook this. The flavor is unbelievable, incredible.
And it's my turn to make something inspired by Chef Gore. It's going to be quite a challenge.
Can you imagine that?
It's surreal, yet so real.
I can't give up. I got some ass kicking to do.
Nice move.
We're pushing each other to explore and experiment in new, different ways.
5, 4, 3, 2.
A warm welcome to Taiwan Plus News.
Exploring the issues that matter to you.
Not just to Taiwan, the whole world is watching.
很多时候是我们眼睛看不到的地方。
We might encounter mishaps and mistakes along the way. But at the end of the day,
it just transmits something straight from the heart. Yes.
Cheers.
Bon appetit. It is about the fun, and it's about the glamour, and it's also about something much deeper than that.
Sometimes you just gotta seize the opportunity. You just gotta do it.
Have a place where you're appreciated for you exactly as you are, and where you can shine and be seen.